If you saw my last monster video essay, link in the corner, you'll know that the Cybermen are my favourite Doctor Who villain, but there is no doubt that the Daleks are the most recognisable, so much so in fact, they are considered by some to be more iconic than the show that created them. However, the more popular something is, the more content that is produced featuring said thing, and more content usually means a higher chance of lower quality products polluting the ecosystem. And of course, the Daleks are no exception to this rule, as the quality of their stories as well as their overall impact on pop culture, much like the show itself, has arguably been steadily dropping since the second wave of Dalek mania, and by extension Doctor Who mania, brought about by the 2005 revival, to the extent that they are often thought of as a joke, not only by the special effects obsessed masses who mock their dated design, but also by the show itself. But what has caused the Scaros looks to face such a decline in relevancy? Why have we gone back to the days of them being seen as objects of scorn and ridicule, long since thought abandoned by the wilderness years? Well, sit back, relax, and subscribe, because today we're going to be attempting to recapture the terror of the Doctor's deadliest foe. Due to the assassination of the at the time current United States President John F. Kennedy on November 23, 1963, most of the general public were too shocked and preoccupied by this tragic event to notice that what would go on to be the longest running science fiction show of all time had just aired its first episode that very same night. It was because of all this, as well as concerns that Doctor Who's producer Verity Lambert, who was also the first female producer at the BBC, was in over her head, that the head of drama at the BBC at the time, Sidney Newman, was told not to commission any more episodes of the show. Doctor Who needed a miracle, a lifeline that could keep its heart beating, otherwise it would have been killed off in its infancy. That lifeline came in the form of two men, the first man being Terry Nation, a man who had initially declined an offer by script editor David Whittaker to write for the new show, who himself was impressed by Terry's work on the ABC anthology series Out of This World. However, now that he was unemployed and had a young family to support, he once again contacted Whittaker, this time accepting the job, which led to him penning what I think is the most influential script in the show's history, The Daleks, otherwise known as the Mutants or the Dead Planet, which saw the Doctor, Ian, Barbara and Susan transported to an alien planet that had been decimated by nuclear war. But from the ashes of this dead world, two races emerge. The Thals, a primitive but peaceful race whose only desire was to live in harmony and restore their planet to its former glory, and the Daleks, formerly known as Carlids, mutant squid-like creatures encased in giant metal shells whose only goal now was to destroy anything that wasn't like them, with Nation drawing heavy inspiration from the Nazis. The second man responsible for the birth of the Daleks was Raymond Cusick, who had to come up with a design that adhered to Terry Nation's vague descriptions of them, while simultaneously fitting within a tiny £60 budget for each prop, which is why the Daleks' two signature weapons were a lot more terrestrial than anyone expected, with an egg whisk being used as the Daleks' main gun, and a plunger being used as a tool to suck out the brains of their enemies, although it is worth pointing out that this was added much later. A common misconception about the Daleks' design is that they were based on the salt shakers in the BBC canteen, when in reality Raymond just used these to demonstrate how he thought the Daleks should move, gliding seamlessly along the ground. Sidney Newman originally disliked the Daleks, believing them to be nothing more than silly robots, or as he himself dubbed them, BEMs, which were the exact things that he had warned Verity Lambert not to include. Thankfully though, he was convinced by Verity that they were more than that, and at last, the Daleks was released to an audience of 10 million viewers, making the villains as well as the show itself household names. With all this buzz, it was inevitable that countless pieces of merchandise would be produced to capitalise on the Daleks' success, which made the BBC, and in particular Terry Nation, who owned the rights to the Daleks, a lot of money. In fact, the Daleks were so popular during this time that two films were released in 1965 and 1966 respectively that loosely adapted their first two appearances with Peter Cushing as the lead, the term Dalek mania being coined to describe their explosion into pop culture. Among this new Dalek media were the stories that preceded their first big hit, with the most notable of these in my opinion being the highly acclaimed 1964 story The Dalek Invasion of Earth, which not only saw the departure of the Doctor's beloved granddaughter Susan, but also brought the Daleks to our world for the very first time, and in the process solidified their status as series regulars. It's also worth noting that this story made the parallels to fascist regimes even more blatant than its predecessor, as the Daleks now had concentration camps and robotic slaves to do their bidding. The brutality of the Daleks' plans would also be exemplified in the fittingly titled Daleks Master Plan, which we know featured the death of First Doctor companion Katarina, making her the first companion ever to die on the show. Unfortunately, 60s Dalek mania would come to a rather abrupt end due to rights complications with their creator Terry Nation, meaning that they only made 2 appearances throughout Patrick Troughton's run on the show, with Power of the Daleks, Troughton's introductory episode, and Evil of the Daleks respectively, leading to the Cybermen briefly taking their place as the most iconic villains of that time. It could be argued, however, that despite some standout moments like the aforementioned death of First Doctor companion Katarina, and even the First Doctor Light story coming in the form of Mission to the Unknown, that the end of 60s Dalek mania and the beginning of the Daleks' slow descent into scorn and mockery can be traced all the way back to the 1965 story The Chase, in which the Daleks can be seen being tossed around a fairground by animatronic vampires. Despite Terry Nation finally agreeing to bring the Daleks back to Doctor Who after trying to pitch a Dalek spin-off show for several years, the resulting stories in my opinion were somewhat underwhelming, due to Terry Nation recycling many plot elements such as the Thals in Planet of the Daleks, as well as more easy defeats like in Death of the Daleks. But with the introduction of the 4th Doctor and by extension the Hinchcliffe and Holmes regime, Terry Nation was forced to go back to the drawing board and create a story that focused on the Daleks' at the time unexplored origin story. The result was Genesis of the Daleks, a fan favourite that is often considered the pinnacle of classic Doctor Who, and maybe even Doctor Who in general. The story sees the 4th Doctor, Sarah Jane and Harry Sullivan walk back to an early point in the Daleks' development where they are tasked by the Time Lords to prevent them from ever existing. I could honestly gush about this story for an eternity, but for the purposes of this video I'm going to talk strictly about why the Daleks are more effective here than some of their previous outings. Firstly, the Daleks are used sparingly but effectively. Surprisingly, considering that this is one of the most popular Dalek stories of all time, the Daleks aren't really in Genesis of the Daleks all that much. However, when they are, their brutality and their motives behind said brutality are made abundantly clear, as in one of the penultimate scenes of the story we see the Daleks refuse to take orders from what they see as inferior life forms, not only because they believe they are better than them because of their biology, but also because they are programmed with the innate ability to survive, so in their opinion it is pointless keeping others around when they can already achieve what they want on their own anyway, which results in them violently gunning down the very car-led scientists that allowed them to develop in the first place, despite their creator, Davros, a character we will return to later, pleading for them not to, saying that the scientists would be useful to them and that the Daleks should have pity on them, to which the Daleks respond that they have no understanding of pity, before violently killing them all along with Davros himself, but not really, after which they declare that they are the superior beings and that they will not stop until they become the supreme power of the universe. In just one short scene, the Daleks' characteristics, beliefs and motivations are all expertly established, without ever feeling like tedious exposition. Another thing that I think helps drive home the Daleks' fascistic inspirations is the sheer abundance of Nazi imagery within the Carlet base, with the military officers adorning thick black boots and a symbol that is supposed to represent their strength on their sleeve, as well as the fact that they literally all do the Nazi salute whenever they greet one another. It's far from subtle, granted, but I would argue that making the parallels between the Daleks and the group that inspired their creation as blatant as possible was of the utmost importance at a time in which the Nazis had become objects of cheap jokes, meaning that there was a very real risk that we as a society would forget the lessons that we had learned from them. But this story reminds us exactly why we were terrified of the Daleks in the first place. Finally, I believe that the tone of this story had a substantial impact on why the Daleks are so effective in this story. Genesis is a very bleak story in which 2 factions are caught in a never-ending war that neither party has the resources to carry on fighting in, to the point where dead bodies are propped up against barracks to make it seem like the trenches are manned. And caught right in the middle of the conflict are the Mutos, the result of the Thals and the Carlet's genetic experiments that they now see as nothing more than flawed experiments that are rejected by both societies, pushing the theme of racial purity, and how flawed of a concept it truly is, even further, as the nicest character in the story outside of our central protagonists is himself a Muto named Severin. So, to summarise, the 3 things that make the Daleks so effective in this story are as follows. Their effective but minimal usage that effectively establish their mortality and brutality to new and old viewers alike, the inclusion of fascist symbolism making their evil as obvious as possible, and the darker tone of the story. This formula would continue to be replicated to various levels of success throughout the rest of Classic Who's run, with writers like Eric Saywood making Dalek stories that are even darker in tone, with Resurrection of the Daleks having one of the highest body counts in the show's history, and Revelation of the Daleks revolving around the transformation of the deceased into food, in order to supply a starving galaxy, and when people found out, they would be converted into a new race of Daleks. This period of time was not without its issues, however. Due to the fact that Davros was essentially the main character in Genesis of the Daleks, it led to a greater focus on his character in the stories that preceded it, with some people arguing that Davros began to overshadow the Daleks in stories such as Destiny of the Daleks, in which the Daleks cannot defeat a new rival species called the Mavellans, leading to them somehow restoring Davros after his death in Genesis, using his intelligence in an attempt to defeat their enemy. This story also fails to understand that the Daleks are not computers, as it is portrayed within the story that the two races have reached a stalemate because they both have robotic brains, which simply is not the case for the Daleks. However, a benefit of Davros' inclusion within these stories was the beginning of the so-called Dalek Civil War, first seen in Resurrection of the Daleks, in which Davros is once again brought back to life, only to this time attempt to sabotage the Supreme Dalek by corrupting the Daleks with a substance that once again makes them loyal to him. This is further expanded upon in the aforementioned Revelation of the Daleks, in which we first see the newly formed Imperial Daleks that are loyal to Davros and have human components face off against the Renegade faction, who believe the Imperial Daleks to be impure due to the alterations made to them by Davros, further emphasising the theme of racial purity that the Nazis infamously believed in. This all culminates in the introductory story of Season 25, Remembrance of the Daleks, which sees the two factions fighting for power over an ancient Time Lord device known as the Hand of Omega. This story explores how truly silly it is to hate something due to superficial differences, as outside of some mutations and a different colour scheme, the Dalek factions appear the same, making the Daleks an allegory for racism as well as just fascism.